Juan, Sigal, Mike, I am super excited to have you here today. I have to say, I woke up this morning one part excited and one part nervous. Excited because of this panel, some of the luminaries in the digital asset space, and as it intersects with the public sector. And a little bit nervous because I'm not sure what I'm going to be able to contribute to this conversation other than just a bunch of questions and then get out of everyone's way and let you talk and answer. So we've got about an hour and I'm going to jump right into this. Rather than try to introduce you, I think it's best that you introduce yourselves and give us a little background about what you've done in your career and most specifically what you've done with the digital asset space. And looks like we got Jay joining us too, just on time, Jay. I was a little worried that you weren't going to be able to make it. Nope. We're live here. So Jay, we're just going to start with introductions. And why don't we go with ladies first? Sigal, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Great. Great to be here. Great to be here with such a terrific panel and old friends and colleagues. So Sigal Mandelker, I'm a partner at Ribbit Capital, which is a global investment firm focused on fintech and crypto. Before I was at Ribbit, I spent a lot of my career both in and out of the government. Most recently, I was the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, and also acting Deputy Secretary for part of that time, where I oversaw OFAC, the U.S. sanctions program, FinCEN, the U.S. anti-money laundering program, intelligence agency, and a global policy shop that also we did a lot of work with the National Security Council. Before that, I was a partner at a law firm for 8 years. And before that, I had a number of roles also at the Justice Department, overseeing a number of sort of high profile cases. But very early in my career, I was a baby prosecutor with Jay, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. And of course, Juan and I also got to work together extensively over the last 20 years.
Sigal, so much. Thank you so much for being here, and great to have you. Why don't we go over to Juan next?
Phong, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be with you and Mike and Sigal and Jay. It's hard to match the credentials of everybody on this panel, but really appreciate it. I'm Juan Zarate. I'm the Global Co-Managing Partner and Chief Strategy Officer for K2 Integrity. We're a global financial and commercial security and integrity firm, consulting in over 100 countries around the world, major institutions around compliance, risk management writ large, fintech. I have had various roles in the private sector. I think most relevant to this panel since late 2013 have been the independent advisor to Coinbase on their kind of regulatory posture and how to think about how they would develop and evolve in the economy and with regulators' scrutiny attached to their growth. Prior to that in government, I was the Deputy National Security Advisor for President Bush, number 43, for combating terrorism. So that was the old counterterrorism czar position. Did that for 4 years. Got to work with great professionals, including Sigal and Jay. And then before that, I was 4 years at the U.S. Treasury Department, where I was the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes, where we built the office that Sigal later led, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. I too am a prosecutor by training, a lawyer by training, started as a terrorism prosecutor pre 9/11, and have been watching the crypto space for quite a bit of time. So Phong, I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you too, Juan, for being here. Jay, you want to go next?
Sure, although I think you've handicapped me by having me follow both Juan and Sigal, but I'll try to keep up with the Joneses.
So it's going to be even worse.
My name is Jay Ramaswamy. As of a week ago, I joined A16Z as the Chief Regulatory Officer of the Crypto Fund. So it's a new position for me. I've been in the crypto space for a couple of years now because I came from one of the portfolio projects called Cello, which is a layer 1 protocol focused on issues of financial inclusion and mobile first, and it's a mobile first blockchain platform. So I've had an opportunity, and I was a chief risk and compliance officer there. So I had an opportunity to try to solve these problems for a project internally. Before joining the crypto space, I come from both financial services and the government, much as Sigal and Juan. I spent a couple of years as the head of enterprise risk management at Capital One. Before that, I was the global head of AML compliance at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And before that, I spent approximately 10 years at the Justice Department. Before I left, I was the chief of the asset forfeiture money laundering section, and in that context, led the prosecution of many large institutions for violations of the Patriot Act and the Bank Secrecy Act, as well as sanctions violations. So many of the laws that Juan helped put into place, I suppose, on the enforcement side, and those included BNP Paribas, HSBC, some of the big banks at the time, as well as Liberty Reserve, which might be interesting for current purposes, since it was, I guess, a precursor to some of the stablecoin platforms that we're seeing today, but not using blockchain technology or decentralized permissionless systems. And before that was also with the computer crime section, so focused on cyber hackers and chasing them around the globe, which was a fun job. And as Sigal mentioned, I was a baby prosecutor in New York as an AUSA in the Southern District of New York, where I sort of cut my teeth on white collar crime. So very interested in this panel, the discussion. I think the topics are going to be very important given what's happening in Washington these days. And so I look forward to chatting with all of you.
Excellent. Mike, you get to follow up on 3 prosecutors with your introduction, so please go ahead.
I've been feeling undereducated. I want to go back and get a law degree. Maybe I can find one on YouTube that I can download and speed watch. I'm a tech entrepreneur, so I started MicroStrategy in 1989, and I've been here ever since.
Great. My name is Phong. I'm the president and CFO of MicroStrategy. I'm here to host this esteemed group of individuals. So why don't we just start with, there's just a lot of confusion right now. Regulatory landscape as it relates to digital assets, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. Would love to hear from each of you. Where do we stand today? What are the major issues that are at hand? How far along are we in regulatory evolution of cryptocurrency? And anybody can jump in and go first on this one.
Well, I'm happy to jump in just quickly because I think understanding the evolution of how people have viewed the crypto economy and the technology helps explain where we are today. And again, I've been fortunate in that I've watched Coinbase grow up and have watched the industry through their lens. I've seen the financial institutions, many of which that Jay was banging over the head with major fines and prosecutions. And then I've been, talking to regulators around the world for many years about these issues. So I've been kind of watching the landscape. And what's fascinating is initially the crypto economy was viewed as kind of this interesting niche market, right? People weren't quite sure what it was. In fact, many of the regulators had trouble even classifying what we were talking about, whether it was respect to tokens or the underlying technology. That then moved into suspicion and concern, right? Can these new technologies, can crypto be used by illicit actors of the type that we were prosecuting or trying to excise from the financial system? We tried in our jobs to make it harder, costlier, and riskier to raise and move money around the world. And so the question has arisen, do these technologies, does crypto give the bad actors in the world the ability to access capital and to do things that are nefarious and strategically dangerous? So we entered into that space where there was a lot of concern. Liberty Reserve was a kind of a precursor case of concerns of these platforms. And then we moved into a recognition that this technology was more than just a niche, more than just suspicious. There was something actually valuable here, the way that Mike described earlier in your discussion with him, Phong. Incredibly important in terms of not just the financial system, but a new way of thinking about managing value and assets and creating financial inclusion and capabilities. And what that's led to is where we are now, which is a point of legitimation of that market, which has required then the regulators to ask some hard questions. What are the systemic vulnerabilities that arise from a crypto economy that is gaining scale and volume, right? When Libra or DM was announced, I think this was really the moment of fruition, asking the question, we're going to reach volume here, right? This isn't just a niche technology anymore where some users are using it on the side of their desk. This is now becoming potentially a volume play. Seeing what MicroStrategy has done with Mike's strategy, all of this added questions about safety, soundness, and systemic vulnerability. Questions about consumer vulnerability around fraud. The Mt. Gox case was an early precursor, but questions as to how we manage that, and then how we manage the illicit finance risk. And so we are at a point now where regulators are having to grapple with all this while there's greater adoption, while there's greater attractiveness, even for jurisdictions to explore stable coins, explore adoption of Bitcoin, as we saw with El Salvador, and to begin to think about what is legitimate and what is illegitimate. How do we define that risk, and how do we then manage it? And I think that's really where we are, Phong. I think everyone around the world, all the regulators, are grappling with how do we regulate this in ways that we understand or that may be necessary to adapt to a very different technology and set of factors, including the decentralization of financial relationships.
Yeah, I love this term grappling. That's exactly what's happening right now, right? The regulators are grappling with the entrepreneurs, are grappling with the financiers, are grappling with the hodlers. So who wants to go next and add a little bit more to clarity to where we sit today from a regulatory perspective?
I'm happy to jump in, and actually maybe, and I thought Juan answered the question very succinctly. We're sort of in a place of who knows, but I actually think it's important before even answering that question, just to take a step back and recognize where are we more broadly with financial services and financial products, et cetera. And one of the first things we have to recognize when we ask that question is, where are we with the 1.7 billion people in the world today, or at least as of 2017, who were unbanked, many of which have access to a mobile phone? I think if you don't start with that question, or if regulators don't start with that question, we're going to go down all kinds of different rabbit holes and potentially constrain this technology in the same way that actually banking is constrained today, right? I think this is a fundamentally different way of operating. There's fundamentally different ways of moving value. There's incredibly innovative ways to engage in a variety of different, not just financial activity, but anything you can think of, anything a smart software developer can kind of think of under the sun. We got to recognize that. Also recognize there are some risks to that, but take a deep look to think about whether or not the current regulatory infrastructure that we have today fits this fundamentally different technology. And if we think that it doesn't, then we got to take a step back and look at what rules, not only what rules you can have in place to get the balance that we've gotten radically wrong today globally, because you have those 1.7 billion people who are unbanked, but also look to see whether or not innovative technology can also help to solve some of those problems. Unless we do that, we're just going to keep fitting square pegs into round holes and not be really forward-looking and creative in how we think about solutions. So today we're in this place where we have the same rules we've had both, let's say, on the investor protection side that we've had since the 30s, on the AML side that we've had since the 70s, with some evolution over time. I like to say, in the 70s, we were still using rotary phones. Banks are today still governed by the rules that we had when we were using rotary phones. Take a step back, look at whether or not those rules fit, are tailored to purpose, and if not, very, very quickly, head in a fundamentally different place.
Not often do you get a chance to look back at an industry the way you are, Sigal, understand what are some of the shortcomings and essentially fix them. And definitely, that's an awesome opportunity that we don't want to squander.
Totally.
Completely understand. Jay, any thoughts on this you want to add?
Yeah, plus one to both have said it. I think if if folks are looking for a lot of disagreement, you might find a lot of agreement on the panel. But one thing that a couple of things I would highlight that I know we're going to get into shortly is it's also important to recognize before we get to the regulatory conversation that there's a fundamental technological shift that the Bitcoin paper represented, and that more broadly permissionless decentralized cryptocurrency platforms represent. And by that, what I mean is it's a value layer that's an additional layer on the internet. And it's enabling the creation of Web 3.0. If Web 2.0 was sort of the social media and the platform era, we're moving to a place where you could have a Web 3.0 that actually addresses some of the shortcomings that we've seen of what's effectively a broken model of the internet. We have one model which is increasingly authoritarian and centralized from a government perspective, and we have another model which is sort of increasingly centralized from a corporate perspective, and both rely on the exploitation of data and less freedom and consumer opportunity and distribution of the fruits of what happens on these platforms. And Web3 represents a real opportunity to do it, but we're in the early days. We're literally in sort of 1995, 1996, 1997 of the internet. And so if you take that as the framing, what it's really important for regulators to understand is not everything is one size fits all here. And while the financial implications have been the important ones that we've discussed today, because these systems require financial incentives to work, the kinds of constructs that we've created, as Sigal and Juan have mentioned, may not apply to a disintermediated world, or may apply to different types of intermediaries that we're concerned about than the ones that we've defined. And it becomes really, really important for regulators to right-size the risks that they're worried about. And we're all going to talk about this more. Illicit finance risk is an incredibly important risk. And I think we've seen a maturity in the regulatory space where regulators now get that Bitcoin isn't just used for crime. And in fact, there are some benefits to transparent blockchains from the perspective of those who worry about illicit finance that don't exist in the current system. And there's a sophistication that's now beginning to take root. And we want that nuance to continue and to think about what would, in a sense, regulatory regime 3.0 look like that would marry to Web 3.0. And I think that's an important consideration to keep in mind as we kind of have this conversation, but agree wholeheartedly with what I heard before.
That's great, Jay. And there are a couple of things that you just said that I want to dig deeper and come back on. One, the metaphor of the internet to where cryptocurrency and digital assets are today. And the second, that Bitcoin isn't just used for crime, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. But Mike, anything you want to add to this one before we move on to the next topic?
Tell me the question again exactly.
Where do you think we sit today from a regulatory perspective as it relates to digital assets and Bitcoin?
I think that the world is evolving at a rapid rate, and we've got a delamination of a lot of institutions and ideologies and metaphors and understanding. So let's just take Bitcoin and crypto in general. The first question is, well, is it currency? Well, no, it's not a currency. That was decided by the IRS. You can't transfer it from person to person without a taxable event. But still, it wasn't really until about 3 months ago that Jerome Powell, Christina Lagarde, and Gary Gensler all started to say it's not a currency, it's a asset, right? Whether or not you think it's a good asset, a bad asset, or a scarce speculative store of value asset, right? Just getting over from currency to asset was a big deal, and we didn't really get to that. And still, I think probably a large number of people still in their mind think it's still a currency, and that creates huge amounts of confusion and noise and chaos. The second question is, well, if it's an asset, how are we going to tax it? Well, we sort of know from the IRS ruling in 2014, but right now you can sell Bitcoin and buy it back the next minute, and there's no wash trading rules applied. This is the one because it's property. Okay, well, it makes sense with a ranch in Texas. It doesn't make sense with an S&P index fund. if Bitcoin starts to look like an index fund and you can sell it with no wash rules, it's an asymmetric benefit, but also it encourages volatility versus other stocks or other equities or other assets. So this idea that, well, is it an asset? Is it property? Well, maybe it's property, but now getting your head around that, it's the first fungible property in the history of the human race. Maybe, well, gold might be fungible property. You might say that $1 million of gold bullion is $1 million of gold bullion if it's London good delivery gold. But, land and buildings aren't fungible property. So a lot of the tax law around property was made for non-fungible property, and stocks and ETFs are fungible securities, and they had a different set of laws. So I think there's an evolution coming in the tax treatment of cryptos in general, to the extent that you can own a crypto, then you're going to get taxed on it. Now, how? If you don't have any wash trading on cryptos, but you do have wash trading on securities, right? It creates an asymmetry, and eventually the regulators will come for that. We can see the House Ways and Means Committee is taking that up as an issue. So I think there'll be motion there. Then the next question is it a commodity or are these things securities? And I think there's broad consensus that Bitcoin is a property and a commodity. There's a great degree of question about what is everything else? Is a stable coin a security? Is a DeFi platform a security? Is a whatever token a security? That's got to be sorted out. And I think the SEC or the CFTC, they have a challenge in front of them. So I think there's a big question mark. Then you've got the crypto economy moving at the speed of light. You've got corporate companies, private sector moving at the speed of sound, and you've got governments that are trying to keep up, right? And they're moving slower than the speed of sound. We can debate how slow. Some are faster than others, but in the crypto economy, they're creating tokens so fast. Now the question is, if Tom Brady creates Tom Brady token, and you can hang out with Tom Brady and his family, for a month, a year, and be in a chat group with him and his wife, and he securitizes that and sells that. Is that a security? And if Tom Brady then gets divorced from his wife and they discontinue the chat group and they stop hosting the barbecues, did he commit securities fraud? And can you sue? So if you're creating all these digital properties, people want to tokenize stock. But right now you can't. They want to tokenize commodities. They want to tokenize art. They want to tokenize tickets and relationships. And obviously Bitcoin is about tokenizing time or energy or the like. I think there's going to be a very interesting set of questions. And of course, every regulatory regime is addressing them at a different speed. I think we're still trying to catch up with the question of, can you trade with 100x leverage or 20x leverage or 1x leverage or 2x leverage, on the platform? And I think, I guess the most interesting questions are, to what extent, will the 20th century securities law get applied verbatim, to all these tokens, or will they construct a new set of laws around stable coins, or a new set of laws around security tokens, or a new set of laws around NFTs or the like, that is lighter or more technical? Nobody knows. And will they apply a new tax code, and will they apply a different AML KYC? And one extreme is if you apply 20th century draconian law, then my conclusion is Bitcoin is property, an institution or an investor can own it. Everything else is a security, and nothing else can trade, or everything else has to all of a sudden trade with 2x leverage with disclosures, and everybody better get a bunch of general counsels and the like. And so that's one extreme. And the other extreme is do nothing and let everything just, flow, which is kind of like where we were never quite there. There have always been regulatory actions for the past 3 years, but something. And then the middle ground would be the CFTC, the Treasury, the SEC of the United States giving some kind of new crypto guidance, which gives people a middle path, which respects the intent of the 20th century SEC laws and securities law, but also it also evolves them into the 21st century. And I listened to all the congressional hearings and all the senatorial hearings, which are fascinating. And I parsed all the testimony of Janet Yellen and Gary Gensler and the like. And I've listened to all the senators and the congressmen talk. My takeaway is Gensler is extremely well informed and very thoughtful. And every regulator in the United States government is about as well informed and progressive about this as you could ever hope for. I mean, they understand the industry, right? Gensler understands the history of every ICO and every token and the underlying technology. So they understand it. And at the same time, I was surprised at the depth of congressional and senatorial support for the crypto community. Like, I would have thought, half the politicians would be against and half would be for, or some people would have different concerns. There's an incredible political consensus on the Democratic side of the House, on the Republican side of the House. It's a bipartisan, senatorial, congressional consensus that this is the crypto industry should be embraced by the United States, and we should move forward progressively. And they're putting lots of pressure, I think, on regulators and the administration to do something progressive. And now, in the defense of the regulators, it's a complicated topic, and there are a lot of considerations. And and sometimes even if you thought you knew the right thing to do, implementing it in the crypto world is not easy. They try to do the right thing and they get a rug pull or something breaks. Implementing it in a corporate environment is not easy. When you have 2,000 employees or 20,000 employees, you've got to jump through lots of hoops and lots of considerations. Like, what do your shareholders think? What do your employees think? What do the lawyers think? What do the HR people think? What does everybody else think? What will the customers think? It's not easy. And it's not easy in a government, right? You got to take your hat off to say the president of El Salvador that managed to actually distribute, the crypto revolution and banking to 3 million people over the course of 3 months, because that is a Herculean light speed move for a political entity. So
great, Mike.
That's what I think right now.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to keep going. We just laid a pretty good foundation, I would say, for the regulatory landscape. So thank you for that. We're going to do a quick lightning round because there's a few missing pieces in that foundation, and I'll call them sort of myths that are out there that are perpetrated by extremely intelligent individuals, high net worth individuals calling Bitcoin and cryptocurrency rat poison. I always want to know who the rat it's killing is out there. You get CEOs saying, how do you know there's actually 21 million coins as the limit? Have you looked at the code, right? And then you have lawmakers who are basically saying Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are for criminals. So Lightning, can each of you give me a myth and give me why it's just untrue as it relates primarily to cryptocurrency and the regulation around it that you're hearing?
Well, it's untrue because the data doesn't bear it out, right? I'm an advisor to Chainalysis. They put out a report every year and they show how, and actually the facts are that the amount of illicit activity that's occurred through, let's say Bitcoin, for example, has just massively decreased over time. My guess, I don't have data to support this, my guess it's no more or no less than through shell companies, et cetera, in the traditional financial system. And it really doesn't make any sense to say that. How could it possibly be the case that you've got Mike Saylor and all kinds of, everybody from Mike to Reese Witherspoon holding crypto? How could that all be illegal? They're just, plus, it is actually in so many respects, for the most part, with some exceptions, much more transparent than what you have in traditional banking. If you talk to anyone who's been both a prosecutor in banking and in crypto, They will tell you that in many, many respects, and I can tell you this firsthand, it's much easier often to trace illicit activity when you're using Bitcoin than if you're hiding money through a whole variety of different means that, Jay and Juan and I have spent most of our careers studying. So, it's super easy to say that it's like rat poison. It's just factually incorrect. Nor does it really actually make sense when you look at the kind of adoption that we're seeing.
Others, anyone else want to add to some myths that are out there?
I would say that some of it is just a lack of understanding of what this thing is. I think, as Mike alluded to, Bitcoin was a very specific example of what the Bitcoin white paper made possible. It tokenizes or commoditizes time, energy in the form of creating an asset that has a store of value. But there have been other iterations, Ethereum and the coins that are created on it, or the tokens, NFTs, others that are really about thinking about how the economy is affected by the digital world. And I'll give you a simple example. I think Sigal appropriately addressed the illicit finance issue, so I won't do it there. But if you think about, for example, what the digital world has done to property, when you or I buy music or buy a book from Amazon on the Kindle, I can't lend it anymore, right? I could lend my book to my brother when I bought it, and if we had the same interest, but I can no longer do that. And in many ways, digital commodities are more like licenses than they are like traditional property. And what this technology provides is an opportunity to potentially rebalance that scale, to allow people to own digital assets like they own physical assets. And that's actually pretty revolutionary. And so I just think that when people say it's snake oil or it's rat poison, they don't quite understand how transformative this technology is to the basic building blocks of the economy, and how things like DAOs are in many ways what the joint stock corporation was to the 16th and 19th, 20th centuries. And we're starting to see that these are going to have social implications much more broad than a speculative asset, but they do rely on the sort of trading activity. That's the plumbing of the system to get us there. And so I would just say to people who say those things, just rely on the facts, just the facts, man. But focus on technology, study it and learn it. And what you find, even in Congress, when we had an ability to talk to people, the divide is not really left and right. It's people who have dived in and started to understand the implications of these technologies, and those that just haven't had the time to. So I think that there's a lot of coming up to speed on what this thing is, and it's not, it's a technology that's relatively new. So I guess that's not surprising. But those would be my comments to disabuse some of these popular notions.
Just to piggyback, if I could, in fairness, as Mike put very well, the crypto economy is a little bit like the elephant, where everyone's touching a different part of it and seeing it in a different way or feeling it in a different way. And I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the gyrations of traditional actors, institutions that are grappling with what Jay just described, which is something rather revolutionary and different. And I think from a regulatory standpoint, it bears underscoring that this is about disintermediation, which is already happening in the financial system, as Sigal said, in the payment system. It's about decentralization, and it's about the democratization of financial and commercial activity. And so you combine all that together with this technology undercurrent that is disruptive to how we've thought about the financial system in the 20th century, fundamentally. The regulators have tried to regulate even crypto through the sense of nodes or clearinghouses. This is why the first set of regulations in the US came to and through the virtual asset service providers. It's really the ability to grasp at and control the nodes and the central features of that system that have been the hooks for the regulators. And the more that system gets decentralized, disintermediated, democratized, unhosted wallets, privacy coins, that abuts against the traditional system. And so I think it's not just people feeling the elephant in different ways. That's true. It's also that they're seeing use cases that seem risky, but we're also grappling with a very different system that doesn't match with what is the traditional regulatory treatment of the financial and commercial environment. And I think that's why you get these kinds of comments. And it's more than just they don't understand the technology. I think it has to do with a fundamental challenge of the way that we've thought about regulating the international financial and commercial system.
Yeah, so let's take that one. Sorry, go ahead.
If I can just say, we've been kind of hard on the regulators, but I actually think what Mike said before is an important point. These are not easy issues. And I don't think any of us should envy the position that regulators are in, where the process itself takes time and the technology is moving at, whether it's the speed of sound or the speed of light, much faster than the process is built to handle. So I think we should be careful about being too, a lot of what we say comes across as critical. It's critical in a friendly way. But I think that it's a very hard job. I think it's really hard to be a regulator today, I think is what I would also just throw on the table. So just wanted to get that.
I agree with you. Obviously I was, a regulator, but I do. So, and I think there are like terrific people in the government who are trying to figure this out. But I do think it's incumbent upon regulators to be in the mode of providing guidance before threats, right? So, and we did a lot of that. In 2019, when I was at Treasury, we issued the FinCEN guidance that literally went through a variety of different business models and said which applied, which didn't apply to the BSA. FinCEN is now having these like terrific office hours where they're bringing innovators in to explain like how their technologies are actually could be actually consistent with the objectives that FinCEN is trying to achieve. I think where we can be critical is when you see regulators threaten enforcement before guidance, because that's in my view it's not the right way to regulate. And I think if those that do so could find themselves in a position where we discover that the United States will have sort of lost potentially its place as the center of innovation in that ecosystem, because the lack of clarity and the threat of continuing to operate without that clarity is just going to end up driving a lot of it elsewhere. So I completely in agreement with you. It's a tough job. I certainly didn't sleep for 2.5 years when I was doing that job, but we also have to, and there are amazing people who are doing this kind of work, but we also have to call on regulators to say, look, you gotta think about what your long-term objectives are and how you're going to achieve them while maintaining where the US has always been in many different technologies, which is the center of that innovation. And there's huge risks that we could talk about ad nauseum to not operating in that
so
way.
let's go down that path a little bit, Sigal, right? Like I think your advice is it shouldn't be regulation through enforcement, regulation through prosecution, and that the decisions presumably we're talking about the US regulators make in the course of the next few years are going to be have long-lasting implications on the competitiveness of the US in general. We see what regulators in China are doing. We see what regulators in the US are or are not doing. We see what regulators, lawmakers in El Salvador are doing. Let's call those sort of three extremes, if you will. What is the advice that you give? There may be some regulators, lawmakers listening right now to get some ideas. What's the advice you would give other than, don't regulate through enforcement? What are the thoughts and why is this so important that they get this right?
Look, the advice that I would give is in part based in what we've seen that's happened with the traditional banking system, which frankly is what even led me to get into fintech and crypto. So I have this view that if you look at US correspondent banking in the last 10 years, the data is very easy to find. You'll see that the number of global correspondent banking accounts has really been massively on the decline. And I saw that when I was at Treasury, and I would travel all over the world, and I'd have senior government officials in emerging markets in the developing world ask me for help getting them access to U.S. correspondent banking. My view is that is at least in part because when we had some of the huge banking cases that we saw in the early 2010s, the output of that was twofold. One, you had a lot of banks appreciate that they really had to up their game when it came to making sure that bad actors weren't able to use the bank to do bad things. But they also then made the business decision to just get out of markets where the compliance costs were going to be too high, and the profit, wasn't going to justify that. And I think what nobody really appreciated at that time was that would be the long-term consequence. And by the way, the long-term consequence of all of that, in my view, is a real diminishment of U.S. power all over the world. Because if you're not operating in certain jurisdictions, your influence and your ability to bring democracy and democratic values in those jurisdictions is seriously diminished, but also your ability to go after bad guys is very diminished, because bad guys that don't actually have that access to the traditional finance, to the U.S. financial system. And so let's take those lessons and think about, how do we do that differently here? How do we construct a system that, again, keeps that innovation emanating from the United States and puts people to the test of being able to operate all over the world with U.S. based, from a U.S. based perspective. And that also requires that when regulators, across the board take action, whether it's regulation or guidance or enforcement, before they take that action, they have to fundamentally sort of game out what the long-term impact, what will the impact be 5 to 10 years from now, if you take an enforcement first as opposed to clarity first perspective. What will the impact be if you don't sit down and talk to innovators and sort of game out, how do we get this right in a way that's acceptable to everyone? So, one of my biggest recommendations is always make sure you know from the beginning what your objectives are. Your objective may be root out illicit activity. That's a super important objective. But if your objective is also financial inclusion and at least in the US, right, making sure that the US remains the dominant actor in global financial services, then everything that you do has to emanate from those objectives. Not easy to do. It's really easy to bring an enforcement case as a former prosecutor. Not very easy, but it's follows the same set of same rule book. More difficult to do before you take an action, game out what the long-term implications are going to be. I have tons of suggestions as to how to do that, but I think that's sort of, as a matter of first principles, going to be really important.
It's great advice. I have kids. It's like the advice you should give to every parent, right? Like you can parent through enforcement and just say no, or you can think about the long term, what you're trying to create, what you're trying to foster. So excellent. Other advice folks would give?
Phong, if I could just piggyback off of that, and we do advise regulators through our firm. In fact, we've drafted some regulations for virtual asset service providers in other jurisdictions, and so we're talking to regulators all the time. I think going back to Mike's earlier point, I think going back to the spirit of what these regulations are intending to do. It's Sigal's point too. What's the essence of what you're trying to do, as opposed to the starting point of what's the existing regulatory framework and how do you shoehorn in, right? So that's critical. What are you actually trying to achieve, and what are the risks that you're then trying to manage? And that's a really important second point, because to date, we've lacked a bit of maturity in how we look at the crypto economy, right? It's either good or bad, all or nothing. And the reality is we've got to treat it like any other asset class or part of the financial system, which is let's manage the risk. And that has to be a fundamental part of how regulators are thinking about the environment. Not all VASPs are the same, not all cryptos are the same, not all actors playing in the space are the same, not all jurisdictions are the same. So there needs to be risk attendant to the space. Third thing, and maybe this is where I disagree with Sigal, I think there needs to be more enforcement, not just for the sake of enforcement, but in disciplining the environment. I think those who want the crypto economy to succeed and thrive want the bad actors to be punished, want them to be called out, want them to be disciplined, right? So that we have clarity around the legitimate economy and the illegitimate economy. And I think that the enforcement part of it, as Sigal said, has to be thoughtful because you don't want negative externalities, but it also has to drive the point that, look, there are these dark corners of this universe, just like banking, just like use of cash, that has to be disciplined. The last thing I'd say, Phong, that we've tried to promote heavily, and part of this is the onus on the innovators in the space. How can technology actually begin to square the circle here? How can technology help meet the fundamental goals of these laws and regulations in ways that protect consumers, that accelerate financial inclusion, that ensure that bad guys aren't the predominant players on a platform or a particular crypto? How do we think about digital identity, right? And these are all things that technology can help innovate and solve. And I think one of the problems we have is, again, an all or nothing perception of the environment, but also not enough challenge with each other, both the regulators and the industry, to say, we can innovate to try to get closer to what we want to achieve here. And I think you're starting to see some of it. And I think we're going to see in the coming weeks and months some announcements and things that will start to attempt to at least have the industry take more ownership of where the regulatory environment goes, which is always a good thing.
I should just to clarify, it's not for me about more or less enforcement. It is about regulation by enforcement, because I don't think that's the right way to go, but it's really about thoughtful enforcement, thinking about long-term, providing the right guidance to the private sector so they even know what the rules are in the first place. That's where, and again, always thinking about, from a US perspective, let's say, always thinking about what will the long-term game it out 3 to 5 years from now. It's not just about an exciting press release. It's about what the long-term impact will be. And if you're not starting with those fundamental questions, you could get it perilously wrong. And I think that's very risky.
Okay, great. So we've talked about, we've laid a bit of a foundation as to the regulatory landscape. And I think, Sigal, you said, who knows? Not exactly about that, but it's around the same time. And we layered in some of the myths and talked about some facts. So that was great. And I love it, Jay, just the facts, man, right? Like, that's important. And now we talked about some recommendations we might give to regulators, where slightly before that, Juan said it's all about just touching the elephant, or how people touch the elephant. But let's bring it home, because there's a lot of folks listening here who work for the public sector, US government, or outside the US. And I think, by definition, you're listening to this, you have an interest in influencing the regulation at some point in time, or at least you have an interest in where the regulation is going. What's the role that the individual, the corporation, a CEO, a holder of cryptocurrency can play to aid in regulation going in the right direction?
Well, I think you have folks, leaders and thought leaders like Mike, who are both committing to the economy and explaining why, right? The session, Phong, you and Mike just had, I thought was brilliant, because, it explains clearly Mike's thought process, why it's critical, not just for the company and shareholders, but for the broader economy and, frankly, US national security interests. And the more that CEOs and those that understand the economy and are invested in it can explain why, the better off we're going to be, because that will deal with some of that underbrush of skepticism that is out there. If you've got smart, credible people like you and Mike and others speaking about it. I think, secondly, there has to be a recognition, and this is, I will tell you, something I've seen in the industry early on, at least, some immaturity, which is to talk about development and technology without recognizing that there are real regulatory needs and demands and goals that are important for not just for business, but for public policy. And so having CEOs engage thoughtfully, again, MicroStrategy, I think, is leading among them, as to how that regulation unfolds and what it should look like is really important. And the third part, I just said it, I think there's room for great innovation in this, whether you want to call it reg tech space or in the domain of how we think about this new economy, the revolution that Jay described earlier. There are ways of thinking about the technology that get us closer to the demands of the regulators and policymakers than I think most people realize. And I think having CEOs, technologists, innovators working toward some of those goals openly, in cooperation, in collaboration, while government tries to ask for it and is not just banging people over the head, to Sigal's point, I think that's really important. So I would say those three things: awareness building and explaining the why, engaging in the regulatory and policy demands that are legitimate questions, and third, innovating forward around how we meet the imperatives of both policymakers and industry.
I guess I would say that the number one thing that CEOs can do, I would sort of put it into two camps. One is in kind of traditional industries that are going to be affected by this new technology. The number one thing they can do is understand and embrace the technology and incorporate it into their business models. And the reason for that is, I think that the system will become more mature and will inevitably fall into the regulatory perimeter the more traditional institutions get involved, because they have certain requirements that will then lead to a disciplining of certain aspects of the system that are required for mainstream adoption. And so I think that's an important function. On the sort of technologist side, what I would say is embrace the reality that this area will come under more social scrutiny and regulatory scrutiny. And that doesn't mean that one has to abandon some core components of what this technology is. There were, before the infrastructure bill, which was the last fight that I think many of us on the phone were involved in Congress, there was a rulemaking process that FinCEN put into place where they were, in a sense, addressing the concerns around so-called unhosted wallets or peer-to-peer transactions. And I think it was important to be able to preserve that aspect of the technology and to figure out ways, as Juan is pointing out, that there could be blockchain and crypto native ways of addressing the risks that doesn't require a wholesale importation of concepts that really don't apply. You can't apply the BSA to a protocol, but you might be able to apply the spirit of the BSA through RegTech if regulators were a little bit more flexible in terms of how they were thinking of things, and if they were willing to embrace a future where peer-to-peer transactions are a reality. And so I would say on both sides, it's embracing the technology and embracing the potential of this technology to solve many of the problems that we've been grappling with in the analog world for a long time. To me, that's the number one thing that can be done.
Excellent. Sigal, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I really agree with everything that Jay and Juan just said. I mean, one of the most exciting things about being in this side of the world is that we actually get to invest in these super interesting technologies that I think have the real potential to get the balance right in a way that I think we don't have necessarily in the existing financial infrastructure system. So I think investing those kinds of technologies, going in and talking to regulators about it and explaining how in the long run they could actually be more effective, not less, just because they're associated with crypto is really, really important. I think when you do that, they get my experiences, they actually get really excited about it too, because they want to be part of that wave of the future that we're also excited about. And then, I think there also just needs to be a lot more education on where this world is going and what it can potentially achieve in the future, and what nobody really knows what the world is going to look like 5 to 10 years from now, but we know it's going to be different and exciting and really interesting and potentially provide a lot more opportunity to a lot more people. And that needs to be well understood and explained. No, don't take it for granted that they understand, what that can look like. Go in and talk to them and have real conversations about it.
Well, I think your 4-point plan that you gave us, 3 contributed by Juan, 1 by Jay, and validated by Sigal. So 1, build awareness, explain why. 2, engage in discussions with regulators. 3, innovate forward. 4, build into your business. I think we've been following your strategy, Mike. We've got 5 minutes left. I want to see, Mike, you had any closing remarks or summary comments in this topic of regulation as it relates to cryptocurrency that you want to end the conversation with.
Yeah, a couple of quick points. First, I think of Bitcoin as digital energy. If we roll the clock back 120 years and considered the impact of electrical energy on the world, and you're talking to companies, you would say, well, first, figure out what electrical energy is. Second, figure out what it means to your business, then educate your people, then educate all of the regulators in your industry. And electrical energy and automotive is different than building, is different than shipping, is different than in appliances. And, do you want to put a hair dryer next to your head with electricity in it, and what's safe and what's not safe? So I think if we think about that metaphor, you just realize you got to do a lot of work. Educate yourself, educate your employees, educate everybody around you, engineer, test again, figure it out. I think with regard to regulation in general, what it occurs to me that there are 3 big opportunities in the 21st century and 3 big inefficiencies from the 20th century. The first is currency is traveling or moving through 20th century banks. And a stable coin is digital currency. It can move 24/7, 365 at the speed of light for free. And 20th century currency moves through central banks, and you can't move it. It takes a month for final settlement, and it might take you 20 years to do final settlement between here and Nigeria, and maybe you can never do it. So the currency in the banking business could be upgraded by a factor of 1,000 if they figure that out. I think the second observation is most assets trade on 20th century exchanges, 9:30 to 4, and they don't trade on holidays. You can't trade a bond on a weekend. You can't trade a stock. They're slow, and whereas currency is controlled by 20th century banks, and they fail, right? And they fail all the time. Most assets are controlled by 20th century exchanges and broker dealers, and they also fail and let people down all the time, and they just don't offer the kind of service we expect in the 21st century. And then the final opportunity, the really deep theoretical opportunity, is most assets trade to the individual in the form of a security rather than in the form of a property. So if I had $1 billion building in New York City, if I could buy the building, if I'm a billionaire and I buy the building, I have the right to lease the building. I have the right to mortgage the building. I have a right to put the lien on the building. I have a right to upgrade the building. I have the right to sell the building to the highest bidder. If I'm a middle-class person and I buy shares in a REIT, or I buy shares in the building as securities, I have none of those rights. I can't sell it. I can't lease it. If it's empty, I can't fill it up. I can't get a mortgage against it. All of my rights are constrained as a limited partner through a 20th century broker dealer. No one's ever going to give you, for example, 4% interest on your Apple stock. You can't do it. But the real promise of the crypto revolution is the idea that we could deliver property rights to the underlying property on a 24/7, 365 basis worldwide to the middle class, to the individual. Once you think about it, you realize that owning the property is an order of magnitude better than owning a limited partnership right in a security to the thing. And what that means is we're waiting for regulators to give us a path to property on a crypto asset, and that will unlock it will unlock 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude more velocity and speed and productivity. And the reason it's an instrument of economic empowerment is the wealthy person doesn't have to be a limited partner, but the poor person can be banked, and everybody can have right to currency and property 24/7, 365, effectively for free from the most competitive bidder, from the best, the highest bidder to sell and the lowest bidder to buy, right? And that's really the power of the cyber economy. And the opportunity for regulators is to embrace and encourage the growth of that cyber economy, because that will unleash massive productivity and flourishing for the entire human race.
What a great way to wrap us up, Mike. Juan, Sigal, Jay, Mike, thank you so much for your time. It's fascinating. Perhaps we could take this show on the road and do it again sometime. I really appreciate the conversation.